They didn't expect this part, not even a little. In their mind, the story was already written. You'd feel the tension, you'd feel the distance, you'd feel the cold shift in energy, and eventually you'd crack. You'd reach out, you'd explain yourself, you'd ask what went wrong, you'd try to fix something they never planned to maintain in the first place. That's how it's always gone for them. That's how people usually respond when connection is pulled away without warning. But this time, something different happened. This time, you didn't chase. You didn't spiral publicly. You didn't demand answers or perform pain for closure. You just disappeared emotionally, quietly, cleanly. And that's the moment everything flipped. Because, to them, this wasn't maturity. It felt ruthless. It felt shocking. It felt like the one move they never prepared for. Here's the thing nobody says out loud. Avoidant behavior only works when someone else is willing to do the emotional labor. Distance only has power when someone is desperate to close it. Silence only feels safe when you believe the other person will eventually break it. That belief becomes their foundation. Over time, it hardens into certainty. They don't even question it anymore. They assume you'll be there, waiting, thinking, replaying, blaming yourself, rehearsing what you'll say when they finally decide to reappear. They assume access. They assume emotional availability without accountability. They assume you'll remain open, even when they close themselves off. And that assumption is exactly why your cutoff hits like a shockwave. Because when you didn't react the way they expected, their internal system stalled, the pattern broke, the script glitched. They pulled away, expecting gravity to pull you closer, but instead, they felt the absence expand. At first, it didn't register as loss. It registered as confusion. Why aren't you reaching out? Why aren't you pushing? Why aren't you asking for reassurance? They check their phone casually at first, almost bored, expecting your name to pop up like it always does. When it doesn't, they tell themselves it's nothing. You're just busy. You'll come around. You always do. But as time stretches, that casual confidence starts to wobble. Something feels off. Not dramatic, not explosive, just wrong. Avoidants are used to being the ones who control distance. They step back, others lean in. They go quiet, others grow louder. They delay, others wait. That dynamic gives them a sense of safety and superiority at the same time. It protects them from vulnerability while feeding their ego. But when you cut off cleanly, without theatrics, without announcements, without emotional leakage, you remove the one thing they relied on without realizing it, their leverage. And the moment they sense that leverage is gone, their nervous system panics, not in an obvious way, not with tears or confessions, but with an unsettling internal pressure they don't know how to name. What makes your cutoff feel so ruthless to them isn't the silence itself, it's the absence of emotional chaos. You didn't punish, you didn't plead, you didn't explain your pain in detail, you didn't try to make them understand. You simply withdrew your energy and, for someone who is used to controlling the emotional temperature of a connection, that calm withdrawal feels brutal. It feels final. It feels like they lost access to something they assumed was permanent. Silence from someone who is hurting can be ignored. Silence from someone who is at peace cannot. They expected a reaction because reactions confirm relevance. Anger confirms importance. Sadness confirms attachment. Even disappointment confirms impact. But when you gave them nothing, when you stopped feeding the dynamic entirely, they were left alone with their own behavior. And that's the one place they never want to be. Because without your emotional response to distract them, there's nothing buffering the truth. They see the pattern. They feel the emptiness. They sense the missed opportunity. And they hate that this realization came too late. This is where people misunderstand the cutoff game. They think it's about punishment or manipulation. It's not. Real cutoff energy doesn't come from wanting them to suffer. It comes from deciding you no longer want to participate in confusion. There's a difference. When you chase, you're trying to restore connection. When you argue, you're trying to be understood. When you explain, you're trying to repair. But when you cut off, You're choosing yourself without negotiation. You're saying, without saying it, that access to you is not unconditional, and that message lands deeper than any speech ever could. Avoidants expect you to fold because folding validates their worldview. It tells them intimacy is unsafe and people are unreliable. It confirms their belief that closeness leads to dependency, and that dependency leads to loss of control. When you chase, you reinforce the idea that distance works. When you wait, you reinforce the idea that they can set the pace. But when you leave calmly, without bitterness, without spectacle, you introduce a new data point into their system, one they can't easily dismiss. Someone didn't chase, someone didn't beg, someone didn't stay available at a discount, and that rattles them more than rejection ever would. The shift usually happens quietly. It's not a dramatic goodbye. It's a gradual internal decision that shows up externally as restraint. You stop checking your phone every 5 minutes. You stop crafting messages in your head. You stop replaying conversations trying to decode hidden meanings. Your energy pulls back before your words do, and on a subconscious level, they feel it. They might not know what it is, but they sense the cord loosening. The attention they took for granted starts to fade. The emotional supply starts to dry up, and suddenly, the distance they once needed feels uncomfortably large. This is the part where they start feeling something they're not good at processing: loss without drama, regret without a clear villain, discomfort without an obvious solution. Because you didn't explode, they can't frame you as unstable. Because you didn't beg, they can't frame you as needy. Because you didn't explain, they can't argue their way out of responsibility. All they're left with is the realization that you chose peace over proximity, and that choice quietly dismantles the power dynamic they depended on. Your silence hits harder than words because words invite response. Words open doors. Words create back and forth. Silence closes the loop. It removes the stage. It forces reflection instead of reaction. And for someone who avoids emotional processing by staying in control, reflection feels like freefall. They replay interactions, not to understand you, but to understand what changed. They wonder when they lost you. They wonder if it was something they said or didn't say. They wonder why you didn't fight harder. And that question haunts them, because deep down, they know the answer. You stopped fighting because you stopped believing the fight would ever lead anywhere. This is the shock. Not that you left, but that you left without trying to convince them to stay. Not that you went quiet, but that your quiet wasn't heavy with longing. It was light, clean, detached. And that detachment rewires the entire story they told themselves about you. You were supposed to be the constant, the emotional anchor, the one who would tolerate ambiguity. When that role disappears, they don't just lose you. They lose the version of themselves that felt powerful by comparison. And here's what makes this moment emotionally gripping for the viewer. Because if you're listening to this and it feels personal, it's because you've lived the other side. You know what it's like to overextend, to overthink, to wait, to hope that patience will eventually be rewarded. You know what it's like to believe that understanding someone deeply will make them choose you more consistently. And you also know the exhaustion that comes from being the only one trying to bridge the gap. This cutoff isn't about being cold. It's about being done with imbalance. And the reason it shocks them is because they never believed you'd get there. When you stop reacting, you stop feeding the dynamic that kept them comfortable. When you stop explaining, you stop justifying their distance. When you stop chasing, you stop proving their theory that people always come back. And the moment they realize that this time might be different, that this time you might actually be gone emotionally, something shifts inside them. It's not love in the way people romanticize it. It's awareness. It's the sudden understanding that they misjudged your limit, and that realization lingers far longer than any argument ever could. Your cutoff game, it feels ruthless because it's clean, because it's quiet, because it doesn't give them a role to play anymore. And the shock doesn't come from the silence itself, it comes from what the silence represents. You chose yourself. You chose clarity over chaos. You chose peace over potential. And once that choice is made, the dynamic can never return to what it was. Not for you. And definitely not for them. And once that realization settles in, once the silence stretches long enough that it can't be dismissed anymore, something unfamiliar starts to happen inside them. It's not dramatic. It doesn't look like heartbreak the way movies show it. It's quieter than that, more unsettling. It's the slow understanding that the control they thought they had was never as solid as they believed. The psychological shock doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in through small moments, a random pause while scrolling, a delayed breath when a memory surfaces, a sudden urge to check, just to see, just to confirm that you're still there in some invisible way. And when they realize they can't feel you anymore, not emotionally, not energetically, it hits them somewhere deep and uncomfortable. Avoidants are skilled at detachment, but what they're not skilled at is losing access without closure. They know how to leave. They don't know how to be left behind by someone who isn't angry, isn't begging, isn't trying to prove a point. Your cutoff doesn't give them a clear narrative. There's no villain to blame, no explosive ending to justify their distance, just a quiet removal of your presence. And psychologically, that creates dissonance. They start questioning their own assumptions. Were they too distant? Did they wait too long? Did they finally push someone past the point of return? These questions don't get answered, and that's what makes them linger. What shocks them most is the loss of predictability. They were used to knowing exactly how much distance they could take before you'd react. They were used to sensing your emotional availability, even when they weren't engaging. But now, there's nothing to read. No emotional pulse, no tension they can lean into, no reassurance that you're still waiting in the background. And that uncertainty is deeply destabilizing for someone who relies on emotional control to feel safe. The power they once held slips away not because you took it from them, but because you stopped offering it. This is why your lack of reaction feels ruthless to them. They expect confrontation, they expect tears, they expect questions. Those things give them something to respond to on their terms. But calm withdrawal gives them nothing to work with. It doesn't invite a conversation. It doesn't offer a second chance, disguised as closure. It simply closes the door. And when that door closes without noise, without drama, without explanation, it echoes louder in their mind than any argument ever could. They might tell themselves they don't care. They might rationalize it as mutual distance. They might even feel relief at first. But underneath that surface logic, there's a growing discomfort. Because your cutoff forces them to sit with something they've always avoided: consequences. Not consequences in a punitive sense, but consequences in the emotional sense. The realization that actions, or lack of actions, have lasting effects. That someone can decide they've had enough without asking permission. That emotional access isn't guaranteed forever. And this is where the internal interpretation begins to spiral. They replay moments, not with empathy at first, but with confusion. They look for signs they missed. They wonder when your energy shifted. They question whether you replaced them, not because they want you back necessarily, but because the idea that you moved on threatens their sense of significance. It's not about love yet, it's about relevance. And your cutoff challenges their belief that they are unforgettable by default. They start constructing stories to make sense of it. Maybe you were never that attached. Maybe you found someone else. Maybe you're pretending to be strong. Maybe you'll reach out eventually. These narratives are protective. They soften the blow. But as time goes on and your silence remains consistent, those stories lose their power. Because the simplest explanation becomes the hardest one to accept. You chose to walk away emotionally, fully, and that choice wasn't impulsive. It was considered. This is when the regret loop begins. Not the dramatic kind, where someone suddenly realizes they're in love. It's more subtle than that. It's the slow drip of what if. What if they had replied sooner? What if they hadn't pulled away during that moment? What if they had shown up just a little more? Avoidants don't feel loss immediately because they suppress it, but once the safety of distance turns into the threat of permanence, the emotional processing starts catching up, and it does so all at once. They begin to feel the absence in ways they didn't expect. Not just missing you, but missing how you made them feel about themselves. The attention, the validation, the stability of knowing someone was emotionally invested, even when they weren't fully present. Your cutoff removes that mirror, and without it, they're left facing themselves. The patterns, the avoidance, the missed chances, and that reflection is deeply uncomfortable. What makes this even more intense is that they can't fix it easily. There's no argument to resolve, no misunderstanding to clarify, no clear invitation to re-enter your space, because you didn't leave emotionally wounded and open. You left grounded and closed. And that difference changes everything. It tells them that if they were to reach out, it wouldn't be on familiar terms. It wouldn't be from a place of control. It would require vulnerability, accountability, effort, and those are the very things they've spent their life avoiding. So instead, they watch quietly from a distance. They check social cues. They look for signs of softness. They hope for cracks in your resolve. Not necessarily because they want to reconnect, but because they want reassurance that they still matter, that they still have access. And when they don't see it, when your energy remains steady and unavailable, the shock deepens. Because now it's clear this isn't a phase. This isn't a tactic. This is a boundary. The emotional attachment for the viewer here comes from recognition. Because you've been on the other side of this dynamic, you know what it feels like to wait for someone to show up differently, to believe that patience will eventually be rewarded, to hold space for someone who isn't holding space for you. And you also know the quiet strength it takes to finally step back, not with anger, not with resentment, but with clarity. That clarity doesn't always feel empowering at first. Sometimes it feels empty. Sometimes it feels lonely. But it's honest. And honesty is what makes this cutoff so powerful. You didn't leave to teach a lesson. You left because staying was costing you too much. That truth is what makes your silence unbreakable. Because it's not fueled by ego. It's fueled by self-respect, and self-respect doesn't waver when someone finally notices your absence. It doesn't rush back to be acknowledged. It doesn't negotiate its worth. As the regret loop tightens, they start to feel something close to fear. Not fear of losing you specifically, but a fear of losing the version of themselves that felt in control. Fear of repeating the same pattern again and again with different people. Fear that maybe, just maybe, they are the common denominator. These thoughts don't always reach conscious awareness, but they sit beneath the surface, creating tension, and that tension keeps you on their mind far longer than they'd like to admit. The irony is that your cutoff doesn't make them suddenly emotionally available. It doesn't magically heal their attachment style, but it does something else. It creates a reference point, a moment they remember, the person who didn't chase, the connection that ended without chaos, the silence that felt heavier than words, and that memory becomes part of their internal landscape. It influences how they approach future connections, even if they never consciously acknowledge it. For you, though, the shift is different. While they're processing the loss in delayed waves, you're moving forward, not because you didn't care, but because you finally cared enough about yourself to stop waiting. And that forward movement is what seals the dynamic. Because once you stop orienting your emotional world around someone else's availability, the attachment loosens, the pull weakens, the need fades, and that's when the power imbalance fully dissolves. This is the part most people don't talk about. The cutoff isn't just something they feel, it's something you grow into. It teaches you that peace doesn't require mutual understanding, that closure doesn't require a conversation, that you're allowed to leave situations that drain you, even if the other person doesn't fully understand why. And that lesson stays with you. By the time they realize the depth of what happened, The moment has passed. The window has closed, not because you slammed it shut, but because you walked away and didn't look back. And that's what makes the shock permanent. They expected you to wait. You chose to move on. And in that choice, everything changed. And once the window closes, something else begins that they never planned for. Watching from a distance, not in a dramatic way, not with obvious moves, but with quiet attention, curiosity disguised as indifference. They don't reach out because reaching out would mean admitting they lost ground. Instead, they observe. They look for proof that you're still emotionally tethered. They want reassurance without exposure, control without vulnerability. And when they can't find it, the discomfort deepens. They check from afar because distance is where they feel safest. Direct engagement would require them to face what they avoided, but watching lets them stay protected while still trying to feel connected. They notice changes. Your energy feels different, not louder, not colder, just steadier. There's no emotional spillover, no indirect signals begging to be noticed. And that steadiness is unsettling because it suggests that your cutoff wasn't reactive. It was resolved. This is where they start to realize something that's hard for them to accept. You didn't just stop engaging with them, you stopped centering them. And for someone who is used to being the emotional reference point, that loss of centrality feels like erasure. Not because they need attention constantly, but because attention confirmed their importance. Your absence removes that confirmation, and without it, they feel smaller than they expected. They might replay old conversations now, but the tone has shifted. It's not about what you said wrong. It's about what they didn't do. The moments they pulled away unnecessarily. The times they assumed you'd wait. The emotional bids they ignored because they thought there would always be another chance. Regret doesn't scream. It whispers, and those whispers get louder at night when distractions fade and they're left alone with their thoughts. What hits hardest is the realization that you didn't leave to prove a point. You didn't leave to be chased. You didn't leave hoping they'd finally change. You left because you were done negotiating your worth. That truth lands slowly, but when it does, it reframes everything. They can no longer comfort themselves with the idea that you're just playing a game, because games have rules. This had a boundary. The moment they realize they lost control is subtle but definitive. It's when they understand that even if they reached out now, the dynamic wouldn't reset. They wouldn't be in the same position. They wouldn't have the upper hand. They'd be the one risking rejection. They'd be the one unsure. And that reversal is terrifying for someone who built their sense of safety around emotional distance. Control slipping away doesn't just threaten the connection, it threatens their identity. They start to sense that your calm wasn't accidental. It wasn't forced. It wasn't a mask. It was the result of a decision to stop tolerating inconsistency, a decision to stop explaining yourself to someone who wasn't listening. And that decision communicates something they can't argue with. You value yourself enough to walk away without drama. That message is louder than any confrontation. Your calm becomes the final trigger because it removes all ambiguity. If you were angry, they could wait it out. If you were sad, they could assume you'd come back. If you were reactive, they could regain control. But calm means closure. Calm means you processed your emotions privately and came out the other side. Calm means there's nothing left to hook into. And that's when the reality sets in. This isn't temporary. This is done. They might wish you would break it just once. A message, a reaction. Something to prove that you still care enough to disrupt your peace. Not because they want to hurt you, but because your peace highlights their unrest. Your silence reflects their unfinished business. And that reflection is uncomfortable because it suggests that while you moved forward, they're still standing in the same emotional place. This is where the viewer feels it deeply because you remember the moment you stopped waiting. The moment you realized that love shouldn't feel like guesswork. The moment you chose dignity over desperation. It wasn't easy. It didn't feel empowering at first. It felt like loss, like surrender, like giving up on something you hoped could be different. But over time, it became something else. It became relief. Your cutoff rewrote the entire attachment script, not just for them, but for you. You learned that walking away doesn't mean you didn't care. It means you cared enough to protect yourself. You learned that consistency is not too much to ask for. It's the bare minimum. And once that lesson integrates,